and indicated that his interpretation was to be preferred to that of a rival sinologist who had translated the same phrase, "The servants destroy the works of art so as not to have to adjudicate on their merits and defects." At that point, like Paolo and Francesca, I did not read further. A mysterious skepticism had crept into my soul. I think that observers of U.S. China relations could be forgiven for sharing Borges's mysterious skepticism. Proffered experts from all over the world looking at the same set of data reach opposite conclusions about where our relationship is headed on a nearly daily basis. We read that relations are good based on things like trade volume and the number of projects upon which we're cooperating, and that relationships are so bad that we may also be headed for war in the Western Pacific. If you've been following the debates over the past year between sort of the bulls and bears on the Chinese economy, you will have probably been struck by this, that there seem to be two highly qualified and entirely opposite camps. And policymakers, of course, in Beijing and Washington also have to contend with contradictory signals from each other. We speak of forming a new type of great power relations to avoid the security dilemma of seeking win-win situations, of avoiding conflict and confrontation, of the need to build trust, even as we conduct war games against each other, hedge against each other, and build or evaluate our capacities in the Pacific, making the worst possible assumptions about each other's intentions. It's very difficult for this reason to have and sustain a collegial conversation with Chinese colleagues, and this contradictory impulses are found on both sides. So we're very glad to have with us three fine analysts of China and U.S. China relations here at the year's end to help set the record straight. And I wanted to do this sort of in the Chinese New Year's tradition so that we can wipe our slates clean. We want to clear up any residual misunderstandings and begin the new year with bright prospects and clean consciences as well. So this is what you are here for. It's clarity and absolution, sort of all in one fell swoop. We'll hear first from Jeffrey Wasserstrom, who is the Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine, and he's the co-author of China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, which had a new 2013 edition, as that was the second edition, we hope with more to come. He is also the co-editor of the Asia section at the Los Angeles Review of Books, editor of the Journal of Asian Studies, and an editorial board member at Dissent magazine. And followers of Professor Wasserstrom's work know, I think, that he brings sort of a special sensibility to his writing on China, and it's one that, for me anyway, is characterized by extremely broad interests and sort of a sense of freshness and excitement for all things Chinese, and also a sense of delight, which is what I see in a lot of the writing you do. And it reminds me, when I look at some of the work that you write, but also that you sponsor and edit, of what a privilege it is to be able to grapple with these issues, U.S. China, sort of on a daily basis. Not only because the question of what China becomes and what the U.S. does and what the U.S. becomes in response to China is one of the most consequential issues we face, but it's also a privilege because this stuff is fun. It's great to get to work in the morning and to grapple with this once again, and it's also very enriching at the personal level as well as essential at the national level. So thanks for keeping us reminded of that, Jeff. And thanks for your suggestion that we hold this session today. This was Jeff's idea, which we're glad to sponsor. David Wertheim, to my far left, is the co-founder in 2011 of Tea Leaf Nation, a website I hope you visited that analyzes the Chinese media, but also that helps us keep tabs on what's really going on at the ground level at a daily basis in China. And this is especially valuable for those of us who've lived in China for many, many years, but are now back here in the States and can't quite have that finger on the pulse. Tea Leaf Nation was acquired in September of this year by the Foreign Policy Group, which is part of the Washington Post. David is also a China File Fellow at the Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations, and his writing has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, the Huffington Post, and in other journals. He's a fellow at the Truman National Security Project and has also practiced law in both New York and Hong Kong, and began in China living in Fuling as a Peace Corps volunteer from 2001 to 2003. Isaac Stonefish, who will speak second today, is associate editor at Foreign Policy magazine and was previously a Beijing correspondent for Newsweek. Like David and like Jeff, his writing covers a very broad range of topics: the Dalai Lama's effects on international trade, China's relations with rogue states, crystal meth in North Korea, and then a piece just this morning on the New York Times in China, and it's called "The Old Gray Lady in Red China, Is Beijing About to Boot the New York Times?" And this is something you might have heard Vice President mentioned in his meetings with Xi Jinping, and there will be a hearing on Capitol Hill about this issue this afternoon, 3:30 to 5,
Yeah.
that a number of us will be going to. And I've been reading Isaac's essays for a couple of years, when one in particular caught my attention, and it was Unlivable Cities, about the pollution and the sort of unhumane environments that are being created in China. And it was a good article in its own right, but I also loved that it referenced a book that I've recommended on my top 5 lists of people going to China for the first time, which is Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. And if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to, if for no other reason, so you understand Isaac's headlines. It's purportedly a series of conversations between Kublai Khan and Marco Polo about Polo reporting on his travels throughout China. But it's not really about China at all. It's a book about wonder. It's a book about observation and the attitudes that we want to bring to something that is complex and mysterious. And with that, we are honored to have 3 such fine observers of China this morning. And we will get right down to it. We've asked Jeff and then Isaac and David to offer their initial thoughts on what the past year has brought in U.S. China relations. And then we want to have a very open discussion with each other and with all of you. So Jeff, if you get us started, please.
Well, thanks. That was a wonderful introduction. I love the idea of being at the Kissinger Institute and having the introduction reference Borges and Calvino. And now I feel the challenge of being delightful, but showing my delight. But I figure I've got to play to my strength. These are 3 wonderful analysts of what's going on in China right now. So what I can do as a historian is reflect on some kinds of contextualization from the past. And whenever this was a year when there were high-profile meetings between top Chinese and American leaders. And whenever there are high-level meetings between Chinese and American leaders, I always think of the 70s. You know, the 70s when a famous American Secretary of State made a trip to China, and when an American president made a historic trip to China. So, you know, there are a lot of reasons to have the 70s on my mind. I'm thinking, of course, of the 1870s, which is when William Seward, who had just stopped being Secretary of State, went on a famous trip to China when he got over there in 1870. And then later, at the end of the 1870s, Ulysses S. Grant, as an ex-president, made the first trip in history by an American president to China. And the 1970s are interesting, too, and I'll get back to them. But first, I thought, you know, the 1870s perspective, if we want to think about how China's rise or where China is now fits into a long-term trajectory, I think it's worth going back to the moment when General Grant, one of the most famous men in the world, traveled to China and met in part with General Li Hongzhang, who was one of the most famous men in the world then, a high-ranking Chinese official. And I've got a Li Hongzhang General Grant joke, which I can tell later if things get slow.
One of many.
One of many, yes, actually. This one is historically based, though. I don't have many jokes that are that. But I wanted to mention when Grant got to China, just to think about how different things are now. He was talking to some Chinese ministers, and he was bragging a bit about what the United States had been doing lately. And he mentioned, we have a country as large as China. We can cross it in 7 days now by special trains. We can throw the strength of the nation upon any required point in a short time. That makes us as strong in one place as another. It leaves us no vulnerable points. We cannot be besieged, broken up, and destroyed in detail, as has happened to other large nations. The wealth and industry of the country are utilized through these new technologies. The Chinese minister said, that is a great advantage. China sees these things and wants to do them in time. So it's looking ahead. And Grant also mentioned that there were some, he knew that there were some Chinese studying in America at that point, and that he knew that one of them was studying at his university, Harvard. And so now you can think of now, of course, at that point it wasn't the children of any of the Chinese top leaders, but we can see resonances of things to come there. But if we think about the 1970s, and the period in the 1970s that I have on my mind right now, and I wrote a blog post about this, is actually not Nixon and Kissinger's visit to China, as interesting as that was. But I've been struck by parallels to 1979, when Deng Xiaoping made his famous visit to America, which is remembered in part for a famous sartorial gesture when he donned a cowboy hat at a rodeo, which seemed to suggest here was a Chinese leader. Remember when Mao and Nixon had met, Mao was dressed utterly unlike Nixon and utterly unlike world leaders around. The idea was Deng Xiaoping was ready to move toward connecting China more with international norms, and putting on a cowboy hat in place of the Mao cap might have been a gesture of moving toward that kind of in-stepness in sartorial terms, and perhaps others with other parts of the world. In this visit this year Xi Jinping made to America, once again it was remembered primarily not through any big breakthrough, but because of a sartorial gesture. It was the Sunnyland became known as the Shirt Sleeve Summit because Obama and Xi were shown walking around, presumably talking. We've never heard how that happened, whether Xi was speaking English or Obama had been learning a little Chinese from his daughters, who at Sidwell Friends have been learning Chinese, at least one of them. And remember, Hu Jintao, when he came to America, the most memorable thing about his one visit, was that he said a few words with one of the Obama daughters in the White House in Chinese practice. But anyway, so there's this idea of 1979 was the start of a Chinese integration into some kinds of global patterns. But the other thing I'm struck by about 1979, two other things. One is that Deng Xiaoping was talking about the need for China to pursue the four modernizations, and Americans were rooting for him to succeed in modernizing China. China needed to develop. We were worried about a weak China then. We were rooting for China to develop rapidly because we thought by developing rapidly, China would automatically democratize. Critics of Deng Xiaoping were also rooting for China to develop rapidly, but they said China couldn't develop rapidly unless it liberalized or democratized its political system. Wei Jingsheng in Democracy Wall had said China needed a fifth modernization, democracy and human rights, because without it, economic growth would face insurmountable obstacles. So one of the key things about the present moment is that China has developed in so many ways, and yet it didn't democratize automatically afterward, the way the Americans were rooting at that point. And it didn't have to democratize first, the way Wei Jingsheng thought it would. So here we are grappling with a China that has developed in many ways, has those kind of railroads knitting the country together that General Grant had bragged about, and yet has not liberalized and democratized in ways that many of us hoped. But the weird part about going back to 1979 to think about it is recently Iran has been in the news, as we know. And the news about Iran is that Iran may be going from an enemy or someplace we don't deal with to one that we deal with quite a lot, the Obama breakthrough. And yet China, things are getting tenser and tenser with relations. If you go back to '79, Iran and China were both in the news at the same time, but in the opposite way. Iran was getting to be a more and more worrisome place for us, and China was becoming a less and less worrisome place. And one final thing, there's a book out about 1979 called Strange Rebels. Christian Carroll, who a contributing editor at Foreign Policy. It's a very interesting book. I'm a 1989 guy, and I just always will be. That's the year that I think really, really mattered in the late 20th century for China and for other parts of the world. But he makes a compelling case for '79 being a forgotten, very important year. And he talks about Iran moving with Khomeini, talks about Deng Xiaoping, and he talks about this Pope that had just come into power, had just been anointed and was making a big impact. And now the Pope has just been named, another new Pope, has just been named Times Person of the Year as of this morning. So we've got the three of those. On the cover of Carroll's book, though, there's a picture of Deng Xiaoping, of Khomeini, of the Pope, and Margaret Thatcher. And I haven't found a Margaret Thatcher in the current world, for better or worse. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jeff. Isaac.
Thank you. So I'm going to keep it brief because I want to hear what you guys have to say and hear more from my co-panelists here. But just want to provide some context into one of the biggest stories of 2013 in U.S. China relations, which is China's treatment of the foreign press. So if you had to rank China's least favorite American behaviors. You could probably say meddling in China's domestic affairs is number one, number two. It's up there anyway. And what that used to mean back when China was weaker relative to the United States was U.S. government criticizing policies on Taiwan, on Tibet, on Xinjiang, just general human rights issues, which over the last couple of years, as China's star has risen, the United States has done a lot less of, for better or for worse. The institutions that do criticize China far more vociferously than they'd done in the past, I would argue, is the foreign media. And especially over the last 2 years, I'm going to cheat a little bit and include 2012 in this, but especially over the last 2 years, there have been a series of stories that have been deeply offensive to the Chinese ruling elite, and especially over the last 2 months, but also more broadly over the last 18 months, we've seen China really trying to crack down against these stories, because they can. And if you try, I mean, we have very little insight into what's actually going through Xi Jinping and other Politburo Standing Committee members and Politburo members' minds. But if we try, I think you can argue that what they're doing does make perfect sense. So, start February 2012, you have the Xilai scandal, where a lot of this ruler's dirty laundry is being aired for the world to see. On some level, you can consider the ruling elite think that's fine. He is slowly becoming an enemy. We don't actually know why he did fall completely. Maybe like Icarus, he fell a little too close to the sun. But anyway, Xilai is being discredited, and a lot of the information about Xilai is coming out through the foreign press. Again, at this point, it's probably still okay. He's becoming an enemy. He's becoming a persona non grata. A lot of what foreign press is reporting does have domestic benefits for the Chinese elite. Even the Bloomberg story that tracked his family's wealth could be argued to further support the case of, okay, Xilai is bad. He deserves to be sacked. Obviously, it's implanting in people's mind that he was allowed to rise so high in the Communist Party hierarchy. He was doing these things all along. Why didn't this get stopped further? But at that point, I think things are still okay. The equation shifted, I would argue, when Bloomberg published its story on the wealth of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's family. Important distinction, they didn't say that he had made any ill-gotten gains in his own wealth. They merely pointed out that his family had been able to grow very, very rich off of his political power. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen Mel Brooks' History of the World, Part 1. Anyone seen that? There's a line that he repeats a lot, which is, it's good to be king. And, this was before Xi Jinping became chairman, but he was already kind of the guy in waiting. And if you get to this position, you don't want people to know how your family is making money off of your deals. You have absolutely nothing to gain if Bloomberg can go in and report all of these salacious details. So you can kind of imagine when you're running a system like Beijing's, the problem with allowing that kind of reporting. And this was compounded in the October 2012 New York Times story about Wen Jiabao, who at the time was premier, sort of a lame duck premier, but he was basically the pinnacle of Chinese power. And the New York Times was able to go in and write this very damning story, again, not claiming that he had done anything inappropriate, but that his family had been able to grow very, very wealthy off of his political connections. So, starting in 2012, you had websites blocked. I think probably the first big move was not renewing the visa of a correspondent, Chris Buckley, in December 2012, who is now still reporting for the New York Times from Hong Kong, still doing a great job, but hasn't really been able to go back to China. His daughter and his wife still live there. He's basically marooned in Hong Kong. And problems were compounded in November of this year. You have a far more assertive Xi Jinping, and you have another story that the New York Times did about Wen Jiabao's daughter and her alleged links with JP Morgan. And some of the New York Times reporters that I spoke to on background said this was really when things tightened up again. So where we are right now is that the New York Times and Bloomberg, the journalists in these bureaus may not have their visas renewed, and it would be de facto expulsion for roughly 24 journalists, which would be China's biggest move against foreign press, arguably since '89 or the Cultural Revolution, or even since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So it's a very tense time for foreign correspondents in Beijing and also for U.S. China relations. We get most of our information about China from the press reporting there. And it's not only us, people in the government, people in the White House. They derive a lot of information from what reporters are saying, and it is a good for the government to be able to get that kind of access. So where we are now, and kind of my projection for 2014, Reuters just did a story this morning saying that Zhou Yongkang, who was the security chief of the 2007 to 2012 Politburo Standing Committee, arguably one of the most powerful men in China then, is now under virtual house arrest. So here we have the highest high-ranking leader to fall, if indeed he is falling, we don't know yet, but highest high-ranking leader to fall probably since '49, maybe the Cultural Revolution, you could argue that, but this is probably the biggest purge that has happened in China in decades, if not since the beginning of the founding of the country. And what's going to be very interesting to see is the ability of the foreign press to actually come and tell us this story, which is going to be, possibly, if this does happen, one of the most important stories that has happened in China in decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. David?
Well, first of all, thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for your thoughts, and thanks everyone for coming out on what's still a pretty cold day. I'm aware of the fact that I am another white man in Washington, D.C., talking about China. That's not something I can change, but I'm keenly aware of that. Every day, as you say, looking into China from afar, trying to understand this vast and complex country is a joy. It's also incredibly humbling. And what I try to do in my work at Foreign Policy, running the Tea Leaf Nation blog, is to, as much as possible, sort of channel the zeitgeist. Whether that's remaining in touch with our diverse group of writers, or looking at what Chinese people are saying, on the grassroots level, on the Chinese internet. It's part of an attempt to understand what's really going on in a country that certainly is not monolithic. And I think we have to be as careful as we can when we talk about China in distinguishing the Chinese government from the Chinese people. And even there, of course, we have two extremely complex and vast groups there. But for analytical purposes, I think it's important always to have that caveat in the background. 2013 was, I think, in U.S. China relations, not necessarily cause for great optimism. And there's been a lot of ink spilled about particularized meetings between the Vice President or President Obama and Xi Jinping, neither of which sort of appreciably seem to move the needle in any fundamental way. And I think that actually speaks to a larger issue, which is worth keeping in mind. We, especially as journalists, are keen to the daily news cycle or the weekly news cycle coming out of China. But I think fundamentally, I remain a stubborn optimist in that I think there's a lot of fundamental common ground between the United States and China. There is not the same fundamental difference in the way that Americans and Chinese live their lives and want to live their lives that, for example, you saw between the United States and the USSR. I don't think that we have that problem, and we certainly have a lot of fundamental reasons to remain simpatico, whether it's the $500 billion a year in trade, the $15 billion a year in direct investment, the millions of people who go back and forth, whether it's to study or to work or to visit. I think these fundamental factors undergird our relationship and provide, I think, some counter-narrative to the fact that only a minority in each country express a favorable view of the other. That's an important data point, but it's also worth noting that if you ask Americans what's the most powerful country in the world, a plurality will say China. And if you ask Chinese people what's the most powerful country in the world, a plurality will say it's the United States. So I think, all of that is perhaps cause, if not for optimism, for a sense that, this curve doesn't bend quite as fast as we tend to think when we analyze it, on a year-by-year unit. But I do think that what Isaac was discussing in particular is cause for concern. And that is, in particular, the deterioration or the potential deterioration in the quality of information that is available in the United States about China. And I think this is really important. Looking every day, as I do, at sort of what people in China are saying and thinking about the United States, I'm keenly aware of the power of perceptions, the power of ideas, and the ways in which the perceptions of the citizenry writ large do drive decision making at the highest level. And I think that's particularly true in the United States and somewhat true in China. I'd like it to be truer. But I think over time, the effects of the kinds of crackdowns that Isaac is talking about could be severe. This is a question that is political, it's economic, it has long-term implications, whether you're trying to invest in China or the United States from the other side, whether you're trying to make a decision as a policymaker, what your daily diet of information looks like and the quality of that information, I think matters tremendously. So I guess I will hold off on making a prediction for 2014, but I think it's worth keeping in mind, one, again, that we have a tremendous amount of common ground. And in particular, I think certain what you could call Western ideas still have potency within China. The fact that there had to be a high-level governmental crackdown on Chinese social media, for example, illustrates that the Chinese government was aware that this was a vibrant and important space. And in that space, over the period of 2012 and also 2013, when Chinese social media in particular became quite vibrant, anyone looking in was able to see that certain ideas have currency, in particular constitutionalism, which is something that the Chinese government has now tried to link to, I guess, pernicious Western thought. But that's something that I think has genuine grassroots support in China. So, yeah, I guess I'll stop there. But when it comes to what the United States can do, I guess I just like to say that, I think the United States is best sold as a country that remains a free space. And maybe we're going to get into talking a little bit more about how the United States should react to what China's been doing recently in its treatment of the foreign press. But I think we need to remain aware of the power that some of our ideas do have in China and to continue to sort of represent those ideas as opposed to playing hardball. But now I'm getting way off topic. So.
I wanted to put a question out to all three of you about what I see as possibly having been a sea change in attitudes or perceptions over the past year. And that is that in some ways it seems to have been a year of mutual disillusionment or even disappointment. And what I mean by that is that even while the leaders of the two countries continue to talk about a new type of major power relations, and even while they seek to underscore the kinds of benefits of engagement that you talk about, I think that one is still sensed in American writing about China. And I'm thinking of things here like the tone of David Shambaugh's new book and some essays that have been written by long-term American residents of China who are leaving. And even in some discussions like this one, a certain sort of fed-upness. And it seems like the disillusionment that has happened over the past years, was this a year in which a critical mass of Americans ceased to hold out any sort of hope that China was changing in a way that would make it easier to deal with. This old idea that China's economic development would eventually lead to some form, not an American form, but some form of constitutionalism or liberal democracy if we were patient enough. And it seems to me that many Americans hold out this hope. They have different timescales that they're thinking it will take place over. But this has been, I think, one of the pillars of American attitudes toward China, which it seems to me might have been removed over the past year, that there's a sense that no, those ideas were wrong. We have to deal with China as it is, namely with the Communist Party at the helm. And on the Chinese side, also it seems to me that there is more fed-upness, that America will not accept China as it is, that it will not accept the legitimacy of the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Last week, as some of you know, we had a conference here with a bunch of young analysts from a major Chinese think tank, and this was the one sort of personal and impassioned question that the head of their delegation put to us and went around to the table to all of the Americans. Do you think that the Americans will ever accept as fully legitimate the nature of the Chinese government? And the answer from all the Americans in varying degrees was, well, no. We understand it, we know that we have to work with it, but we won't. And of course what the Chinese hear in that little survey is that peaceful evolution or some form of regime change, disdain for China's government, and therefore China, remains a fundamental American position. And one gets the sense in the past year, perhaps, and this is the question, that the Chinese are also, there's a fed-upness and throwing up the hands with that. You know, if we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, well, by all means, let's be damned because we do. And a determination to go forward and by its own lights. Again, this is a question about sea changes and broad attitudes on both sides rather than any one specific event. But looking back at the past year, that's one of the things that I think might have changed. And I just wanted to ask you to respond to that.
Can I just jump in? I think one problem that plagues the relationship and yet also gives a possibility for the relationship, which fits in with some of the things David was saying, is there is a reservoir of quite positive and hopeful feelings about the other country that's just there, ongoing. I felt it very personally when I was over in China in '99 during the anti-NATO protests, and the U.S. and Britain had led the charge to bomb in Serbia, and the Chinese embassy in Belgrade had been blown up, and there were 3 Chinese killed, and there were anti-American protests. And yet I felt like at that moment I'd rather be an American than a Japanese person in China at that moment. I felt that there could be things that could connect in a positive way to America, even at a moment when there was great anger at the government, the American. There was a possibility of positive feelings about American popular culture. I saw some students who went to call Down with America wearing t-shirts from their favorite American bands and things like that. And so there was that kind of possibility. So there's always this possibility, an interest in the culture, the other one, even with the fed-upness at the government. And so I've talked about this as big bad China and the good Chinese. And the question is how much, in a sense, the focus on the country is the focus on the government. And so what we may have seen part of this at the level is in the last year, the emphasis has been on what the other government stands for and less about the culture. But I think one of the things we fall into this trap whenever there's a new Chinese leader, there are exaggerated, in the last 30 years, there have been exaggerated hopes for the idea that since they're talking about reform, and they're really talking about economic and social reform, they must, in the back of their minds, want to also have political reform. And we keep relearning the same lesson. I mentioned 1979. Deng Xiaoping came to America, he talked about economic and social reform, and he cracked down on democracy wall. He made it clear he was not going to be doing a certain kind of political reform. But we keep having to relearn this and be re-disappointed. We were disappointed with Hu Jintao, and now we've been disappointed again with Xi Jinping, when it turns out he's an authoritarian, nationalist, modernizer who wants to tinker with things in the economy and the social structure. And that's very similar to what Deng Xiaoping was. He identifies with Deng Xiaoping. He does not want to be China's Gorbachev. We want him to be China's Gorbachev. We're going to be disappointed.
Right. I think Jeff did a really good job of answering most of that question. I'm just going to add something on what you said about rather being Japanese than American. So I think the Chinese, generally speaking, have very good feelings towards the Americans. I don't know if I've ever met a Chinese who really hates Americans and vice versa. And unfortunately, I can't say the same thing about Japanese. every time I go to China, every time I've been to China, I lived there from 2006 to 2011, I was constantly shocked at just how much the Chinese loathe the Japanese. I mean, it's very, very visceral, and it's very, very worrying. And when you talk about the ADIZ, when you talk about anything that China is doing against Japan, there's so much popular support for this idea of making Japan pay and taking back from Japan what the Chinese claim is rightfully theirs. So in terms of long-term issues, I'm not worried about a war breaking out between US and China. I'm much more worried about China and Japan going to war and the United States having to figure out how they're going to deal with that.
You may have seen a piece by William Wan in this morning's Washington Post about a Carnegie and I guess Chinese military think tank joint survey of attitudes that would support both of your points, that many of the Chinese attitudes are perhaps more positive than the Pew survey that David referenced, which showed, I think for the first time in 2013, a majority of people in both countries have a negative attitude toward the other. There's a piece that somewhat qualifies that in this morning's Post, which is worth looking at.
And those, looking at the data that I've seen, it goes up and down year to year. The standard deviation is not particularly wide. So I think it's a low, but it's not a low by much. And I think the distinction between the people and the government is often elided when these questions are being asked or considered. So I think that's one of the complications is when you ask somebody, well, what do you think of China? That's, even if you say the Chinese people, which is still a huge category, I think people think in more geopolitical terms. And they may not give the same answer if you ask a more particularized question.
I think just with the anti-Japanese sentiment, I think it's really crucial to say this is something that has been cultivated by patriotic education in the last 20 years or so, and the playing up of things like the Nanjing massacre that were not, it is rooted in historical events, but it's historical events that are spun in a very particular way by the government that keeps it there.
David?
I just want to ask a question, though, and this is something that sort of haunted me as I tried to prepare for today and think about these questions. Do we, in the United States, have a clear goal in our relationship with China? Is it to be liked? Because there would be some easy ways, in particular dealing with the Politburo, to get them to like us more. We could say sorry about the whole New York Times and Bloomberg thing. We'll get those guys out of your way. Or is it to be liked by Chinese people? Is our soft power where it needs to be? Or is it none of the above? Is it regime change in 20 years, which some people would still say is a goal? I think a lot of those goals are actually in conflict. And so maybe part of the complexity of this is that the United States doesn't appear to have chosen one. So I thought I'd just put that out there to be provocative.
I think that's a good question. And my sense with that, both for the United States and for China, is that international relations are all about domestic politics. So the United States policy towards China depends on what the officials who are doing the policy, how they figure that's going to play in the United States. And I think it's even more true for China. The Chinese government is far more sensitive to its own instability than the United States government, and also to keeping hold of power. So when they think about dealing with the United States, I feel like their first thought is, how is this going to, in a broader sense, how is this going to allow me to keep in control of China?
See, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this Chinese government, Chinese people distinction, recognizing the complexities of the government and the people and very broad brushstrokes here. It seems to me that framing mechanism sometimes plays a little bit too easily into our own sense of the role that we want to play in China, and to this sort of Dorothy fantasy approach to foreign affairs, where if we can somehow get into China and throw a bucket of water on the wicked witch in the form of liberal democracy or constitutionalism or whatever it is, the Chinese people will then say, "Hail Dorothy." I think they'd say, "She may be a witch, but she's our witch, and what are you doing in the castle?" At which point Dorothy has a problem, because all those guys with big droopy mustaches have big pikes. Is that really a good framing mechanism, or is that something, obviously something we need to be attuned to, but I see too much, especially from American politicians and on Capitol Hill, this notion that there's a bad Chinese government and a good Chinese people, and that we are somehow ordained to be the stealth spokesman for what the good people would say if they could. And I don't know what that claim is based on, and I'm not even sure that it holds up.
Well, I think part of it is getting an idea that Chinese people, like American people, are capable of holding contradictory positions in their mind about things at any one moment, and that their positions change. So somebody who you've published, both of you have published and collaborated with, and actually I've worked with in a piece she did for Dissent, Helen Gao, who, if there's one young reporter in China to follow, I'd encourage you to follow her. She wrote a piece called Diaoyu in Our Hearts, I think it was called, an amazing piece in The Atlantic, which was partly about an online poll that was saying that this was the height of a lot of anger about, and a lot of Chinese people thought that the Diaoyu Islands, which the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, should belong to China. But the online poll said, and if you had a child born on those islands, what citizenship would you want them to be able to claim? And a lot of them said, you know, these islands belong to China, but I'd want my kid to be able to be a Taiwanese citizen, because then they'd grow up with cleaner air. Or I'd want them to be a Japanese citizen because they'd have more freedom of speech. Or certainly a Hong Kong citizen. So, you know, this capability of having these partly contradictory ideas in mind. And also we should realize America is not a stable, yes, there is still admiration for things about America, but I think we should come to terms with the fact that we don't look so good right now. If the argument is you should be like us, and you know, and it's not government spin or misleading things for the Chinese press to say the American government seems to have a lot of trouble getting things done. I'm an outsider to Washington, so I was just walking here and I noticed these signs up at busy corners saying "No gridlock, please," about not having track. And I thought, really, you know, this would be is this a sense of irony? But there's also Edward Snowden. I mean, this was the year of Edward Snowden, and if people were thinking around the world of being less enchanted by an idealistic view of America, this has been a year where I think there's been a lot of reasons for fed-upness.
Right.
I love that word, by the way. I'm going to start using it.
And I think that's a very fair criticism. I mean, soft power is not a silver bullet. It's not a catchphrase. You know, as Jeff is saying, it springs from fundamental successes and failures in our own country, which I think plays into Isaac's point that a lot of what drives these relationships is domestic. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think succeeding economically, continuing to represent internally the values that we espouse externally is a profound project, and one that we can't just spin in a convenient way and in order to sort of, you know, convince everybody in China. Mm-hmm. I think of it much more as this accretive process and this investment whose dividends are not always evident. I think it's in, you know, the anti-American protests that never happened, or you know, the war that was avoided, or the conflict that was avoided, that we can't report about because it never happened. But I do think that reservoir of goodwill that we can build does play in, you know, from both sides to sort of the underlying stability of the relationship. So I agree it's not a silver bullet, but I do think that there's a reason that, you know, we focus on these things. And, you know, I think America, the United States, does best in this soft power way when it's not trying. You know, if you look at what went viral in the Chinese social web, at least before it got so censored that it's sort of hard to parse. You know, for example, the asset disclosure of American officials. You know, a list of the top 50 asset holding cabinet members and members of Congress, which, you know, as an American, you read it and you think, wow, it's too bad that you need to be worth $50 million to be elected to the Senate. But, you know, from the perspective of some Chinese citizens, it's quite impressive that at least we have that. And that's something that has been, that people have been pushing for as an internal reform. So I think it's little victories like that add up and I think sustain some, you know, positive image of the United States.
Ambassador Locke buying his own coffee and carrying some. I mean, this was great. And the fact that it was so hard to imagine a Chinese official doing that. And then there was a story about a Chinese official taking an ordinary taxi, and then it turned out to be a rumor. I mean, that actually couldn't.
That didn't happen.
Didn't happen. And, you know, that, I agree. The accidental soft power victories. That's interesting.
Well, with that, let's open it up. We've got mics on either side, and yes, sir, first hand up, back on the right.
My question is at least partially for Jeff, but because it's historical, and partially for the whole panel because it's about how the past projects to the present. It's my impression that in our relationship with China, at least on our side of the Pacific, a substantial part of our policy is dictated by or strongly influenced by multinational corporations or U.S. large corporations. And it's my read that in the past, no great power relationship has ever been determined by economic interest or business interest, not between us and the Soviets, not between the Brits and the French and the Germans, the Brits and the Russians, and you can project that, I think, all the way back to the Romans and the Persians. To what extent does this dominance, if it's true, help or hurt the American side of this relationship?
Wow, that's a really that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think at one level, it's a reason for a kind of cautious optimism that because because so many of these corporations actually have investors on both sides and are dependent on flows between the two places, that in the long run, the fact that it's getting harder and harder to talk about a distinctly American corporation or Chinese corporation, the entwinement of the economy. And there are people who understand this much better than I do, including Jeff Dyer of the FT, who's got a book coming out on U.S. China relations early next year that I recommend you to be on the lookout for. And it deals in part with the entwinement in economic and even currency terms, that it's not the same kind of winner-take-all setup that maybe we imagine it to be when we think in terms of great powers. And James Fallows writes about this very well as well, I think, that just things like the debt being owned in China also gives an incentive for, it puts a check on how far the Chinese government will want to go in potentially destabilizing relationships when what they care about so much for staying in power is in part economic growth and stability. So I think that would be one part of the answer, but it's a really interesting thing to think about, the different role of companies in setting this. And you'd have to look at, I guess one of the places to look at would be what happened when it didn't rise to be the great power, but Japan's rise. Certainly corporations were a big part of that, and American anxiety about Japan was once running almost as high as anxiety about China is running now.
So in part, it was a very good question, and in part because I don't have a good answer for you, I'm going to pick up on one of the things you said about great power relations. And that, I think, getting back to your question about sea change over the last year, this is the first time where we've had a Chinese leader who appears to credibly believe that the United States and China should interact on equal footing. So we saw that with Sunnylands. We, I think, are going to keep seeing a lot more examples of Xi Jinping, regardless of whether or not Chinese believe that they are on par with America. Xi Jinping appears to believe that it is in China's interest to make that impression. So I think that's going to really, as it evolves, I think that's really going to change the tenure of the U.S. China relations in everything from human rights and the United States' lack of ability to criticize China on it, to trade, to international politics, to dealing with Japan.
Sir. Right up front.
I'm Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Robert, I'd like to offer a comment on your thought about the Chinese people and the Chinese government. I've been very frequently surprised, appalled, at having conversations with close colleagues, Chinese colleagues, and thinking that they were very progressive and open-minded folks. And then when push came to shove, I found that they were deferring to party wisdom and really quite readily overlooking things that would seem to most people outside of China as absurd actions by the party and so forth. So it's been amazing. But I do have a question. With respect to the handling of journalists, I've tried to figure out where this comes out well for China and the Chinese government. If it expels such a large group of people, it seems that is a great smear, will draw a lot of attention, hardly curb the interest in it. It's hard to imagine, however, that they back down. Somehow, it seems to me that maybe China is backing itself thoughtlessly into a corner on this. How do you see an outcome that favors the Chinese views on this thing?
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, I would say, I think we can assume that these actions come from the very top. And if you look at it from the interests of Xi Jinping and his circle, this is a great move. So, think about yourself individually. I'm sure there are things about yourself that you wouldn't want people to really, really dig into and report. Maybe not you, but someone else. Maybe me, maybe other people. On a very individual level, if you have the ability to prevent people from doing this, and if you think that, as the most powerful man in China, he could maybe make this case that it's important for him to not have to deal with these distractions and not have to worry about losing legitimacy because the New York Times or Bloomberg is going to write embarrassing things about him, his family members, or his peers. Okay, so, you're offending America. You're losing a lot of soft power for doing so, but you all are also protecting your interests, and you are shouldering up your ability to keep ruling China. And again, the most important thing for Xi Jinping and the rulers of China is their ability to keep ruling China. And that has to be where all of their decisions come down to. So that's how I would see it.
Yep. Did you have a?
No, I think that's absolutely the case that would be made internally. That's how the party views it. And from their standpoint, their ability to rule China is directly linked to China's benefit, right? So the continued rule of the party is what's best for China, and therefore anything which threatens that threatens China's interest. I think that's how they see it. The counter argument that I think can be made is that you cannot neatly cleave the political from the economic, and that's been.
Is this cleave apart or cleave together?
Cleave
Cleave is one of
apart.
these words that cuts both ways.
You cannot neatly sever those things, although that's sort of been the party's approach. But I think the argument that you have to make if you don't like this, as I don't, is that this makes China, it makes China more of an inscrutable place to Westerners, and therefore it makes it a less attractive target for investment. And I think that's the argument that we have to be making. That has to be an argument in China's own self-interest.
But I think we should remember too that China hasn't done it yet. All we have so far is a non-reissuance. And I think China has more than made its point. It's probably been somewhat surprised by the attention that the Biden trip and now the hearings are bringing to this. And they can end up issuing visas at the very last moment, creating maximum inconvenience, making all the points that you described, but without going that extra distance, and probably still knowing that that the New York Times and Bloomberg and others have received the message. So they could get the benefits, it seems to me, that you're talking about without taking that final step and getting into a series of tit-for-tat, reciprocal, kinds of competition between the United States and China. So I wouldn't be surprised if they present us with a sort of a gray area where it's inconvenient. People may leave for 2 days and have to come back. 1 or 2 may go while 22 stay. I wouldn't look for an absolute clean decision one way or the other. I think it's going to be a little more muddled.
I think a crucial thing to keep in mind with all of this, which some of the journalists writing of it have underscored, is in some ways a bigger issue is the change in the climate for Chinese journalists and the dangers to Chinese journalists and the way in which this can be in part a message that if we're even willing to take on the foreign news agencies, just imagine how precarious your position is. And one of the first big news stories of the year in 2013 was the tightening of the screws on Chinese domestic journalists. And I think if we want to get back also to the kind of a trajectory, not a long-term back to the 70s, 1870s or 1970s, but just back to 2008, if we imagine what there was a kind of optimism about the potential, overstated optimism about what the Olympics might do in terms of liberalizing China. But early in 2008, the earthquake, in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, it was really powerful to turn on NPR and have an NPR team reporting from a disaster zone within a Communist Party-run country. And part of this was like, boy, things have really changed. And it was a symbol of that. And it could fit into this narrative of slow but sure liberalization, at least of the flow of information. But then the Chinese government started tightening up when reports started to circulate, especially in Chinese media, about shoddy school construction. And suddenly it went from being this, oh, let reporters go on the ground and cover things in ways they definitely couldn't in earlier disasters, and they definitely couldn't at that point in Myanmar when there was a disaster. It went to a kind of tightening up. And I think part of, again, the fed upness is there was hope around 2008. There was a great deal of optimism about China reaching a phase, the Chinese government reaching a phase when it could be self-confident enough, hosting the big Olympics to say, okay, now we'll put behind us some of this kind of insecurity pattern. And what we've seen since 2008 in a lot of different forms is the Chinese government both seeming stronger than ever and proud of the strength, and yet incredibly insecure and doing these moves that don't seem to make sense. And I think it keeps, there's the killing the chickens to scare the monkeys, and also sometimes shooting yourself in the foot, at least if you're trying to develop soft power and cultivate a good image. But I think when push comes to shove, the desire to maintain control, both to maintain the kinds of perks of being top leaders, but also the need to project a sense of strength, and strength in the face of any kind of foreign efforts to dictate something about China. It's one of the few cards that the Chinese Communist Party still has to play. It's one of the few stories they can tell about themselves that still work. The story that they were going to create a more equal China doesn't work. The story that they would create a China without corrupt officials doesn't work anymore. These are the stories they told in 49. But they also told a story in 49 and after that only with a strong Communist Party in charge can you keep China from being pushed around in one way or another by foreigners.
Just in closing on this topic, Evan Osnos of The New Yorker had a story recently in which I thought the starkest statement was that China has lost interest in developing soft power. It's willing to take these hits. Yes? No, down front. Yes.
Hi, I'm Rose Chen. I was born and raised in Taiwan, so I like to offer you a different perspective about Japan. Both my parents, they're from mainland China, and all the Chinese remember the story. Japan colonized Manchu for many, many decades before World War II, and before American Pearl Harbor, China was fighting the Japanese for more than 4 years. So the story we heard from our grandparents, our parents, our families is deeply imprinted on our memory, collective memory. So it's not uniquely mainland China story. It's not Taiwan, it's the whole overseas Chinese. Okay, Japan never apologized for the crime they committed. They conduct biological warfare on living Chinese bodies. And due to the political situation quickly deteriorated after the World War II, Japan somehow reaped reward and get the benefits of American support. So this is a bitterness the Chinese will never forget. And Japan also, in recent years, tried to change the history in their textbook, and they provoke the Diaoyutai situation by purchasing it, from so-called owners. So I'm very disappointed in all the reporting here, never being mentioned. And also, I'm from Taiwan, and Diaoyutai belongs to Taiwan. I was very disappointed with Ma Ying-jeou's stance on this, because I remember when I was in Taida, He's the president of our student council. Anyway,
Thank you. Isaac?
Yeah, thank you for your comments and for sharing that. A couple of points on that. First, what's interesting, China and Taiwan agree that the Diaoyu belong to Taiwan. They just don't agree if Taiwan belongs to China. So I think they're in agreement there. And I will say I respectfully disagree with you on your points about Japan not apologizing. Japan has apologized. High Japanese government officials, prime ministers have apologized, I think dozens of times for what happened in China during World War II. I think the bigger issue and the troubling issue is that as opposed to, say, Jews in Germany, as a Jew myself, I've also heard stories of Nazi atrocities, but it's not something that is a burning issue for me today. I think both Jews and Germany have been able to move on from what happened in the 30s and 40s. Chinese and the Japanese have not. And I think it's a very, very troubling issue, and the problem is, in my mind, not that Japan hasn't apologized, but that there is so much hatred, especially among the Chinese, but also among the Japanese as well. And the best way forward is to figure out how to let that hatred dissipate so that the two countries can live together.
Question? Ken?
Hi, Kent Hughes, a public policy scholar here at the center. I want to borrow on Robert's fed-upness perspective and apply it to the economic dimension of our relations with China. You see it in the House Intelligence Committee in their comments on doing business with Huawei. You see 60 senators, including Rob Portman, former U.S. trade representative, signing a letter saying you've got to do something about currency manipulation in future trade agreements. Even the multinationals are increasingly impatient at the inability to protect intellectual property in China. Do you see this dimension? Well, this, of course, adds to the enormous current account deficit and the analogous current account surpluses in some countries, including China. Do you see this economic dimension exacerbating tensions with regard to China over, let's say, the next decade?
Take that?
Well, there are a couple people in the audience that I'd love to have up here on the stage, I think, to answer that. Hank, do you want to take the mic on that one? Because I think the answer is yes, but let's hear from someone who knows more about it than.
I don't know. Hank Levine from Albright Stonebridge Group. Thank you, Robert. My view is that actually since March, we have begun to see on the economic side, some pretty dramatic statements coming out of China on economic reform. And even this morning, announcement of yet another central government announcement doing away with a number of government approvals, rumors now of the National Development Reform Commission having its powers reduced. And so, in other words, my sense, and I work with a lot of multinationals, is that over the last 4, 5, 6 years, the mood has been souring to a certain extent as far as the U.S. business community was concerned, as people felt that economic reform and opening had come to a halt or even begun to move backward. I think what's happening now is, with the results of the Third Plenum and concrete steps that are being taken, there is some cautious, and I emphasize cautious, optimism that maybe things are starting to turn around again. And if the reform and opening process on the economic side gets going again, then I think that has the potential actually to begin to reduce the tensions. But the devil's in the details, and of course there's always the question of how far, how fast will they in fact go. But at least from my perspective and from the companies I talk to, there is at least some glimmering of hope. The stuff on the Hill, by the way, let me say, I'm just not impressed. The whole issue of the currency has been kicking around for years. The Congress has never taken action on it. Admittedly, there are some people who like to emphasize it a lot. The big multinationals actually don't care about that issue. And I tend to think that the whole currency issue at this point is more smoke than actual fire, but that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Thanks, Hank. Right in the middle.
Hi, my name is Laura Schwartz. I'm from the National Bureau of Asian Research, but I've also worked with the National Public Radio Ombudsman, so this question's kind of coming from both of those perspectives. I was wondering if any of you could speak on the issue of self-censorship, both with foreign media and Chinese media, and how, if there are any trends you can see over the waves of tightening and relaxing, although of course it's a difficult thing to measure. But if you had any thoughts on that and its issues in relation to perceptions in Chinese people and American people as well.
I can definitely say, there's been a crackdown on Chinese social media in particular. So a few months ago, Chinese authorities went after so-called big Vs. This is Chinese slang for internet commenters with wide followings who had effectively become opinion makers within the country. We're talking about people with 20, 30, 40, 50 million followers. So they have the ability using social media channels to reach, the same number of people that the Communist Party, that were the membership of the Communist Party. I mean, we're talking about that kind of scale. And a number of them were brought in for questioning, or were detained, or arrested for under various charges. So over the last few months, at least on Chinese social media, which was the freest space for political expression in China, there's been a great deal of self-censorship. Speech there has gotten much less political. It's a much more curated environment. And to be sure, there have always been more people interested in Kobe Bryant and the latest movies and songs than there were in constitutional reform. But that contrast, I think, has gotten even more stark. You had something called Document Number 9, which has been circulating within the higher ranks of Chinese authority, which basically says, has a laundry list of criticisms of the regime which are effectively verboten, and tries very explicitly, actually, to link ideas like constitutionalism to Western incursion. So I actually wanted to just go back very briefly and speak to your point, sir, about, when you speak with somebody who you believe is progressive, but then they may also be nationalistic. And I think it's important to note that for a lot of people within China, some of what we would call liberal or universal or Western ideas are naturally attractive to the extent that they're seen as something that will make China better off. And I think if I'm going to go back even further to the best way for the United States to deal with some of these things, I think the Chinese authorities are very keen, actually, to tie some of these liberal ideas to the West. Forget for a moment that Karl Marx himself was German. And I think that is something that they've been successfully able to do. They've created an environment where speaking about liberal ideas, speaking about asset disclosure, for example, speaking about constitutional reform, has become seen as something that is off limits, that is sort of vaguely and threateningly Western. And they've been quite successful. So I hate to be pessimistic there, but that's something that I've seen go up quite a bit in the last 6 months or so.
Anything on American self-censorship in this environment?
So you probably saw that really good Emily Parker piece in the New Republic about this topic. I think what we may see if China decides to start treating foreign correspondents more like domestic correspondents, there are a lot of excellent Chinese journalists out there who are not able to write what they want to write because of government pressure. It's far, far worse for Chinese than for Americans. That said, if the equation starts to shift, it is going to be interesting to see how that changes the calculus of what foreign reporters in China decide to report about. If there's going to be people who try to be on the human rights beat because they don't think they're going to be in China a long time and kind of free up their colleagues to pursue stories that are going to allow them to develop. If there are going to be areas that are undercovered. I think it's more worrying for a place like Bloomberg than it is for the New York Times. The New York Times is a news business. Bloomberg is a business. And if someone at Bloomberg were to decide that, as they should running a business, that business concerns are paramount, then hard-hitting China reporting doesn't make business sense. So, it's still a developing story, and we don't know now, but could be a problem.
Down front. Oh.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'll throw a couple things in later. Go ahead.
Yes.
Xu Wu from Arizona State University. I have a question to Professor Weatherstone, but also if the panelists can chip in. Since you're a historian and you look at the issues from the historical perspective, and if you look at China's kind of orthodox history textbook, the year in 1894, which is the year of Jiawu, when China lost the war to Japan, has been considered the lowest point of China's kind of bitterness and suffering. And incidentally or not, next year, 2014, is also the year of Jiawu. And also that's actually two zodiac cycle of Jiazi, 两个甲子. So have you considered about this timing or what it may play into Chinese decision maker or Chinese public kind of psychology, because it's very sensitive?
I'd say I love the fact you brought up the Chinese, for those of you who don't follow it, they're 60-year cycles, and 60-year cycles have the same kind of resonance as centuries. So it's about to be Mao Zedong's 120th birthday, and that's being marked with a lot of pomp in certain areas, while at the same time Confucius is being celebrated, which is a really bizarre thing because Mao thought Confucius stood for everything he didn't stand for and things. So it's a very interesting, promiscuous balancing act with different things going on. But that, I think, is always worth keeping in mind. So when it was the 60th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, there was a really big celebration of the kind that we would associate with a 50th anniversary or a centenary here. So I haven't thought about that particular one, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind. But you can, I wanted to go back to the question about Taiwan. There's no question that Japanese imperialism was a horrible thing. It was modeled in part on Western imperialism, but that doesn't make it any less terrible. What I was trying to get at is there are times when it is emphasized and times when it's not. So Mao tended for a period to say, let's not focus on the trouble we had with Japan, because he was trying to move toward different geopolitical arrangements, and he focused on American imperialism during the time of the Korean War, and America has things to answer for in China. Some people in Chinese textbooks now about national humiliation, the image often isn't of 1894, but it's of 1860, when the Summer Palace was destroyed by British and French troops. So you can divide up the blame in different directions at different things. So I could imagine, though, the 120th being a moment with a lot of intense remembering of that particular moment. It was a complicated one, 1894 and 95. I won't go into a history level lesson. This won't be on the midterm. But it was after that there was a lot of soul searching within China about how to do things differently. And it was the launch of a really fundamental reform move several years later by intellectuals to think about, well, this isn't working. What should we be doing? And there was a lot of thinking going on there. So
we'll have the gentleman behind Doug, and then Doug.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for all the panelists coming. Thanks for presentations. My name is Terry Zhang. I'm a contract researcher with the National Defense University here in DC. I have two questions. First of all, maybe you guys already know, China has spent millions of dollars on here in Times Square to broadcast China, to sort of present a beauty China. However, it looks like it's a failed campaign. Would you mind to comment on what went wrong of that campaign? Secondly, it looks like China-U.S. relationships has been dominated by either economic issues or regional territory disputes. What either side should do, especially on U.S. government, to move the media freedom higher onto their agenda? Thank you.
Well, one thing about this whole soft power thing, I think China's soft power exercises in the last 10 years haven't all been failures. I think the Olympics opening ceremony succeeded very much in doing one of the things that it was trying to do, which was to get overseas Chinese to think about identifying and investing in a China associated with its culture, as opposed to China purely identified with the Communist Party state that they've been alienated from. And so I think if we talk about how some of China's projection of itself into the world has worked, we need to think about different audiences. And it may have worked to some extent even with things like Taiwan investment in China and things that are quite important to the working of the country. But I agree that things like the Times Square one didn't work that well. I don't know what would raise media freedom on this.
Yeah, well, in terms of the soft power question, I mean, I think it shows that you can't, you can't just plow money into it. It's not something that can be done from the top down. Soft power can't happen by diktat, and that's a hard sell to Chinese authorities. And they've been very clear that the media is part of the party apparatus. That's how they see it. And in the last couple years, the means of publication became available to everyone within China because of the internet. And I think in the last few months in particular, the Chinese government has tried to rip the microphone back out of Chinese people's hands. And unfortunately, from the soft power perspective, the best way to deploy it is individual people, whether they're sports stars or entertainers or entrepreneurs or professors or opinion makers, having their voice reach the rest of the world. So that's not altogether surprising to me.
And, for your question on media freedom, I'll just focus on international media freedom. Biden did raise the issue, which was a good sign. Next steps that people are talking about is some sort of visa reciprocity, whereby Chinese journalists or Chinese executives from Xinhua or CCTV would have their visas delayed or possibly rejected. And the most credible proposal that I've heard, and this is not to say that anyone in the government is thinking about this, but just among talking with other journalists, would be something that targeted high-ranking CCTV executives, so that it wouldn't be seen by Americans as really something going against press freedom or going against a 25-year-old journalist who's just trying to make it in America, but rather a 50-year-old Communist Party apparatchik in exchange for the New York Times being able to report in China.
Doug, and then here.
Doug Spellman. I'm still at the Kissinger Institute and was more actively for several years. I don't want to let you all get away without commenting on the air defense identification zone issue, which in my view is the most worrisome issue now between the two countries, because, well, it's a security issue and you've got actual military forces arrayed close together, and I find that very worrying. So I'd like to ask, are you worried? And if so, how do you see both sides climbing down from this somewhat? It's a very complex issue. I realize not just the U.S. and China, of course, Japan and South Korea are intimately involved.
Would it help?
I'll just put out one small thing. It seems to me what we have to watch very closely is how the Chinese actually implement this zone. Right. They put out some very worrisome verbiage in the initial announcement, but so far they haven't done much. So is that possibly a way that this will ratchet down, or other thoughts?
ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. There's been a lot written, you probably read it in the Western press. A lot of the work has focused on China's, the hit to soft power that China's taken. It's been called an own goal. China has been scoring a lot of own goals. This is the analogy that you see, because they've tended to, with the announcement of the ADIZ, confirm the worst suspicions of a lot of its neighbors, that China ultimately seeks a zone of deference in the Western Pacific. They've made it more difficult to form some sort of new relationship with the United States. They've raised the expectations of the Chinese people, perhaps in a way that could rebound against them, so that the talk has been of own goals. I tend to think that's the wrong analogy. I think that probably from Beijing's point of view, while they are taking these soft power hits, they are at the same time achieving their objectives. They are putting down markers that they will not take back of vague claims, and the ambiguity works in China's favor here, that this is somehow, and it need not be filled in great detail now for China's purposes, a Chinese zone. And they have done this in part to be consistent, in part it's about the Diaoyu Senkakus. But I think that they probably feel this is a win for them, despite the own goals. And we shouldn't gloat about China's own goals if behind the scenes they're busy buying the stadium, such that they will be able to rewrite some of the rules. I would not be surprised to see zones also vague, with perhaps a better rollout in the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea in 2014. I think that's quite possible. In fact, China, if they are driven in part by consistency, you would almost expect them to do that. So I think that they see this as a win for them, and probably the wiggle room lies in the ambiguity in the things that China now doesn't do. Nevertheless, the marker is out there, and so there won't be a rollback. There will be a new normal, as I see it going forward, because I think this achieves China's goals. We'll continue to,
I mean, I would. It worries me, and it worries me in the sense that it fits in with a trend of the Communist Party leadership, I think, feeling it has fewer and fewer stories to tell in an assertive way that work for them, and seems to be gravitating toward putting more and more emphasis on these kinds of nationalist stories, which I think are, and I think if we get back to what the year 2013 was like, 2013 was also a year when there was disgust by Chinese as well as Westerners with things like the level of pollution and food safety scares, which weren't new, but were growing. And you think of this as yet another, the best story the Communist Party could tell after 1989 was, you may not like us being in charge, but under our watch, life does seem to be getting better and better. And people either felt that life was getting better for them, or felt that if it wasn't getting better for them, many of them could think, well, at least for our children, it will be getting better. And admittedly, there were some places and some populations left out of this kind of narrative, but for the more articulate kind of population that they were caring about outside of peripheral zones, that kind of could work. And now you're seeing that story also not working, along with some of the others. And so some very unsavory stories, including this intense desire to rein in any kind of unrest on frontier zones such as Tibet and Xinjiang, though that's not a new story, the belligerence toward neighbors, all of that, I think, fits in a sense into a worrisome pattern.
We will, Doug, we have a panel, a speaker this Thursday, Michael Yehuda, on Sino-Japanese relations, and then Ed Luttwak next week on China's strategy with Ambassador Roy as a discussant. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about the ADIS. We started a few minutes late, so we will take one final question and go a little bit over deadline. Sir.
Thank you very much. Jeff Dyer from the Financial Times. I have a question for Jeff, actually, related to this issue of journalist visas. This kind of visa harbor has been played with academics for quite some time. There are famous examples, Perry Link, Andy Nathan, but also lots of people who have written about Xinjiang or Tibet who have found themselves formally and informally in various kind of blacklists over the years. So my question is, to what extent has that fundamentally shaped the way that Western academics write about China, and if there are any lessons that the media should learn from that or be aware of, given the experience of the last decade or so with this kind of policy?
Great, great. By the way, I love getting smart questions like these have been tough ones, because the book that I've done, with China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, which we just updated with, I updated with Mara Cunningham, it's all question and answers. So these are things that could go in the next edition. That's a really tough one, and it's a good one. But I would begin by answering the way some of the discussion about journalists. The real worrisome story, the most worrisome story right now is Chinese academics and the limitations on their freedom and room to maneuver. So in other words, there's, as bad as the implications are for what something an American academic writes and doesn't, or does and doesn't, isn't able to get a visa again, it's not as bad as the firing from their jobs that's going on, which there was a report of another apparent case of this in Shanghai. And I think this is really chilling. And I think this is part that what happens to American academics can also be chilling within China. I mean, I think one of the things about the story with American academics is I think the most worrisome part about possibilities of self-censorship are early in one's career and in certain disciplines particularly such as like political science, where you need to be on the ground to do certain kinds of things. So in fact, I don't think, while there are historians who have trouble with visas for various reasons, it's a different kind of issue than it is for others. And also once you reach a certain level of seniority, I think the attitude can be, I can make the rest of my career without going to China. I am not going to self-censor myself and avoid any kind of topics. I write about Tiananmen every year on the anniversary. It's not staying away from it, but you're more vulnerable earlier in your career. And I think the journalists who are more vulnerable are the ones who put the most investment into long-term language learning and developing a kind of expertise, which is what I feel is so unfortunate. We have, at the moment, such a great group of journalists in China, some of whom have done that kind of long-term commitment, some of whom have learned very quickly in the field and so forth. I actually worry about the issue also with academics. If academics start having less ability to go to China, it will actually hurt the reporting coverage of China, because, no disrespect for journalists on the panel, a lot of really good writing, including a lot that ends up in Tea Leaf Nation, and before that I think we were able to do on the China Beat, is pieces that have some of the dimensions of journalism, but are done by people who are in unusual parts of the country and have unusual perspectives, in part from what they're doing. They're often academics or academics in training, or people just doing interesting things in China that have nothing to do with either academics or journalism. And I think an enormous amount of really interesting writing is coming out of China. And I worry about all kinds of ripple effects, including China just seeming a less engaging place to go for people who could tell those kinds of stories if the journalists they admire and the academics they admire start having more and more trouble going there. I think with the lessons perhaps from the academy, and what I'd like to see academics do more of, is institutions that have a strong need to be engaged with China, but that China also has a strong need to be engaged with, could do more to exert pressure on their Chinese partners and collaborators. And I think particularly to protect Chinese academics, I think it's in some cases, at least with certain institutions, China needs the collaborative imprimatur of having exchange programs with some American universities. And those American universities could stand up more strongly to Chinese pressure. The other thing is that with the academic side, it's so scattershot. You know, some people have been banned for reasons you can point to, but others have been banned simply by the bad luck of having a chapter in a book that comes to the attention, that has nothing to do with anything political. This happened with the people working on Xinjiang. That I think actually for academics, it would be really stupid for us to worry a lot about what we're saying, at least on topics when we're commenting to the press or the news, because there's no kind of logic really to how this could be done. So I think the worrisome part is it might lead people early in their career to steer clear of certain kinds of topics that they thought were sensitive. But I think I have no time for at least senior academics whose careers are in order to not be forthright into speaking out about things like human rights abuses in China.
David, Isaac, any very brief last thoughts?
Isaac, anything to add?
So over the last couple of decades, a question that is often asked in DC and other places in the United States is what can the US do to change China? Last couple of years, that question has been asked less, and I think an interesting question to try to think about as we move forward and to see if there is any answer for this, or just try to see it from China's perspective, is what can China do to change the United States?
That's very provocative. I can't top that.
Okay, well, we're all provoked, which is good. That's what this is about. I'd like to thank our panelists, David Wertheim of Tea Leaf Nation, Isaac Stonefish, Foreign Policy, and Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom of UC Irvine. And thanks to all of you for coming out this morning. 谢谢.
Thank you.
Borges and the Wizard of Oz.
That was nice.
Borges and the Wizard of Oz.